We continue this week our journey through the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to talk today about the next two extensions that are found in chapter 5. Last week we looked at the first three and we saw that they dealt with the way our anger and our jealousy causes us to destroy ourselves and our relationships. What matters most is what is in the heart, because who we are and how we move through the world comes from the inside out. Today, we heard two stories about how we need to view the other people in our community. The two extensions we hear today are a prohibition against oaths, that your yes be yes and your no be no's, and the second, which we know as the command to turn the other cheek. Both of these extensions are about human dignity. Throughout the Bible, God is often trying to restore the wholeness of the people in the midst of the story, often against the desires and wills of the other people in the story. We see so often the underdog, the outcast, the little brother, the blind, the ones in captivity restored to their fullness in the eyes of God. My favorite story along this path is that of Hagar and Ishmael. When Sarah believed that she was barren, she gave up on God and convinced Abraham to have a child with his servant Hagar, because Sarah and Abram believed he deserved a son to continue his family line. We're going to set aside the outrageousness of that opinion for today. Over time, this adventure is successful, and Hagar has a son, Ishmael. Sarai is consumed with jealousy, which was a predictable outcome, as Jesus noted in the previous extension of not coveting our neighbor or committing adultery. And so God blesses her with a son, Isaac, which God had always promised to her. After Isaac is born, Hagar and Ishmael are driven from the home into the desert with only the barest minimum of rations, and in so doing, removing them of any humanity. You cannot drive a mother and her child into the desert if you see them as fully loved and fully beloved children of God. God had other plans and quickly restored Hagar and her son their dignity and their hope. Now, the Bible and the Quran differ slightly in this story, but both agree Hagar and Ishmael had run out of their food and were burst into tears. God then sent an angel who opened her eyes and showed her a well. The angel extends the first promise to Hagar of restoration, saying, "What humans meant for evil, I meant for good." And then tells Ishmael he will be the father of a great nation. Sarah and Abraham intended to strip them of all humanity, all dignity, by driving them into the desert and breaking their obligation to them. God restored those essential elements of life and pride, dignity and self-respect and honor to those whom were deemed worthless. Which leads us to the two extensions that we see today. First, and Jesus tells the people not to invoke the name of God as a way of making a promise or make your words seem more real or more sincere. The commandment in the Old Testament is to not bear false witness, which is not merely refraining from lying. Instead, the Old Testament has a deeper understanding of this prohibition. The rabbis tell us this commandment, do not bear false witness, is about promising to do something and not doing it. It's about the gulf between the words we say and the actions that we do. The most harmful saying in all of parenting is the one, do as I say, not as I do. I remember a friend who taught kinder music sharing a story of a time when a child, maybe 4 or 5, hit another kid in her class. It wasn't a serious thing, but she wanted to raise it to his attention, so she told his dad. And he turned to his child, cuffed him on the back of the head, and said, "We do not hit." It's hard to tell a child not to hit if you are in the midst of hitting them. Jesus is telling us here, one of the few things that we control in our life is the words which come out of our mouth and the actions we do with our bodies. As we'll see more in the next extension, our words should match our actions, and what we do with our bodies should tell the world about who we are in Christ. There is a second assumption bound up in the prohibition against evoking God's name in an oath. When we swear by God or do that Scarlett O'Hara thing where we say, "As God is my witness, I'll never go hungry again," we are making an assumption that God is about to endorse and agree with whatever we are about to say, and this is a dangerous act. God is at the core, a mystery. Even the name we say when swearing by God is a mystery. Letting your yes be your yes and your no be your no without the need for extra moral collateral is a way of showing your respect for yourself and for the other person in the conversation, and your respect for God. God is not a toy or a slogan to be bandied about, but a powerful living being with agency. So we better be sure when we invoke God's name, we are doing it with reverence and with fear and trembling. We need to be careful about evoking God to back up our behavior and our beliefs unless we are for darn sure that we're going to follow through and that it is what God would want. Living up to our values is an important part of building our self-esteem and creating a confident, positive view of ourselves and others. There are few things we regret so much as what we had planned to do and then don't do. Not bearing false witness is about promising to do something and then doing it. It's about the gulf between the words we say and the actions that we do. We should be able to trust ourselves, and others should be able to trust us because we are who we say we are. We are reliable, without having to back up ourselves with a promise that God likes us too. Our actions and our words will show God's influence. Which brings us to the more complicated of the two commandments today. This is known in Latin as the lex talionis, or the rule against violence. The ancient law, an eye for an eye, was ubiquitous in the ancient Near East. Every society, from the Babylonians to the Egyptians to the Romans and the Greeks, had a similar law. And frankly, the concept of eye for an eye sounds awfully barbaric. You don't respond to violence with violence, or you're not supposed to in decent society. But the literature of the time when this law was introduced indicates the eye for an eye law was an improvement. It's a law designed to prevent the escalation of violence and limit vengeance. You can see a situation where someone loses an eye in a construction accident. So he goes back and kills the guy who did it, whose brothers get riled up and go back and attack the first guy's family. And before you know it, it's the Hatfields and McCoys, and you've started a generational conflict over a stolen pig. Eye for an eye was a limiting principle. It's a gross one, but a limiting one. An eye and only an eye for an eye. But it turns out this practice was never common in Israel. Israel instead established a monetary reward policy for the injury very similar to the one that we use today, because they said no two eyes are exactly alike, and so you can never actually equal out an injury. Jesus then is not talking about physical violence or the proper response when someone attacks you violently. Second Temple Judaism has an extensive system of justice which dealt with such attacks. Instead, Jesus is addressing what we should do when we are embarrassed or humiliated in public. Being slapped with an open hand is intended to humiliate the person being slapped. Here, a right-handed person is slapping someone in the face, so it's even more humiliating because they are doing it with the back of their hand. Jesus here is addressing what you should do when someone denies your humanity and attempts to say you are less than you are, so small that you can be slapped with the back of your hand. The lawsuits and being forced to carry someone's luggage are the exact extensions of the same principle. It's an attempt to humiliate you by removing what protects you and by forcing you to go where you don't want to go. Yesterday was Juneteenth, which is a new holiday for many of us. But it celebrates the day that the last slaves knew they were free, when a battalion of U.S. soldiers showed up in southern Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation officially freed them. They notified that the last people held in slavery were free, that their humanity had been officially restored. The grossest part of slavery, among the many gross parts, was the way that the people who were held in slavery were removed of their humanity. They were stripped of their clothes and given clothes to wear, which the owner gave to them as they saw fit. They were renamed with one name which they did not choose and which symbolized their supplication. They were hit and slapped and humiliated. I was watching Finding Their Roots the other night, and Leslie Odom Jr. was the person researching their genealogy, and the host pulled out a slave schedule where the people were given a monetary value and listed by age and physical characteristic to help establish the value of their owner's household. Not their value as a human, but as property. Leslie Odom Jr.'s ancestors' value was listed as mother and child, $950. Their humanity had been taken, and each of the prohibitions Jesus lists this morning inflicted upon them. Their clothes taken, their forced to being work against their will, being slapped in humiliation. And so we remember the beginnings of the restoration of their dignity and their humanity. Jesus himself lived out the words he said here. When he was humiliated and stripped and forced to carry his cross, he did so standing up straight in the face of his oppressors. And he held on to his own humanity. When the descendants of those slaves began to stand up for their own humanity, they did so with sit-ins and marches, not with violence. Defending ourselves and returning violence for violence only escalates the problem. Excusing our own behavior because someone else did something worse denies our own responsibility for letting our yes be our yes and our no be our no. Jesus reminds us to remember we are beloved children of God, and we are worth more than what others try to force us to be. No one can make us respond in violence. No one can make you respond with hate. No one can force you to continue the cycle. You can choose dignity and self-respect and respond as Jesus responded, not by backing down, but by refusing to let someone make you less than you are. These extensions are not about protecting yourself, but refusing to allow others to take your dignity or to set the terms by which you have to live and act. You can choose to stand up for yourselves and others, and in so doing, show them the well in the middle of the desert where God begins to restore what others have tried to take away. Your yes can be your yes, even when others try to make it no. And you can choose to restore dignity to others and yourself through your words and your actions. God bless.